You can join us live every Tuesday starting at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and every Friday starting at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time by visiting freedomslips.com and clicking on Studio A. So with me today, I have Johnathon Simon. But before we get to that, I'm going to ask you a question. What is a whistleblower? Well, a whistleblower is a person who makes public disclosures of wrongdoing, corruption, and crime. These courageous people often suffer retaliatory actions because of their disclosures, but in the end, many of these people are often the catalyst for needed change and are eventually lauded as heroes. And I'm here to celebrate these heroes and give them a platform because shining a light on wrongdoing, wherever it occurs, plays an important role in keeping society peaceful, free, and just. So again, I have Johnathon with me, and Johnathon is the author of Code Red, Computerized Elections and the War on American Democracy and executive director of Election Defense Alliance, a nonprofit organization founded in 2006 to restore observable vote counting and electoral integrity as the basis of American democracy. As a result of his prior experience as a political survey research analyst in Washington, Dr. Simon became an early advocate for an exit poll-based electoral burglar alarm system, independent of media and corporate control, to detect computerized vote shifting in election 2004. In the absence of such a system, he was nevertheless able to capture and analyze official exit poll data briefly posted on the web prior to its election night disappearance, realizing as the following day dawned that he was in fact the only person in the world in possession of this critical data, which went on to serve as the initial basis for questioning validity of the 2004 presidential election. Dr. Simon has gone on to author both individually and in collaboration numerous papers and articles related to various aspects of election integrity. He has worked in cooperation with many election integrity organizations, appeared in several election integrity related films, including Stealing America, Vote by Vote and Uncounted, The New Math of American Elections, and as an interviewee on dozens of live broadcasts. He tweets at Johnathon Simon 14 and invites all interested in corresponding to connect with him through LinkedIn or the Code Red website, which is www.codered2008.com. And Dr. Simon is a graduate of Harvard College and New York University School of Law. He is admitted to the Bar of Massachusetts, and today he's here to speak with my audience and talk about his book. So, Johnathon, thank you so much for agreeing to the interview.
Thank you, Ella, and thanks for providing a platform for people who are trying to get at the truth of things, which is a tricky thing these days.
Yeah, it really is. So, because we have an hour, one of the things I'd like to do is I consider this platform as an educational platform, and maybe we can touch upon the history of voting. And before that, I'm very curious how you got into this, why you became compelled, why you were interested, and what drove you to where you're at today.
Well, that would be a long story, but I guess the brief version of it is that in watching the 2000 election and the Bush v. Gore decision at the Supreme Court and what went on at the Bush inauguration, where literally tens of thousands of protesters, I mean at least 50,000, probably closer to 100,000 protesters were there, and we were effectively disappeared by the mainstream media. The headline said a few hundred protesters or whatever. So I got a very early sense that we were in for a rough ride at that point, between the courts, collaboration and undermining democracy, between the problems with the vote counting itself, and now looking back historically, we know that was more than the hanging chads. I mean, there were 18,000 votes that were deleted, or actually negative 18,000 votes awarded to Al Gore in Volusia County, which changed the whole way that the election was portrayed and who actually had the lead in Florida. So it was already getting pretty dicey at that point, and that was before the full computerization of American elections. And then in 2002, that event came about ostensibly in response to the debacle of Florida in 2000, and we had the Help America Vote Act, and now there was carrot and stick, were both used to get the states to computerize their elections in a big hurry. And the motives behind the Help America Vote Act could be a whole program in itself, and some of the shady characters involved. Bob Ney, the congressman from Ohio, who later went to federal prison, and the whole computerized voting industry. It was a pretty under the radar sort of stealth attack on our democracy that really, at the time, nobody noticed or appreciated. But I had served as a polling analyst in Washington earlier on in my career, and so I had a pretty good understanding of exit polls and how exit polls worked, and I also had some connections in the industry. So when the 2004 election came around, I was actually sitting up that night. I didn't know how to do screenshots at the time. I was pretty new at that aspect of things, but I literally printed out hundreds and hundreds of pages of exit poll data, which happened to have been left up inadvertently, it appears. It usually would have disappeared within minutes. It was left up for hours until about 1 in the morning. And then that data was then, I did an analysis overnight, statistical analysis, and detected all these patterns that were at odds with the vote counts, and that were particularly at odds in significant places. So, in places like Ohio and Florida, these battleground states. So it was a pattern of disparity that I noticed that just really screamed electronic fraud, manipulation of the vote counts, which by that point were largely computerized, and in the hands of corporations like Diebold, whose chairman had said he would deliver the electoral votes of Ohio to the president. Diebold was, headquartered in Ohio at the time. He had written this in a letter to the shareholders or to the board, and lo and behold, he did, and under incredibly suspicious circumstances. So as the sun rose the next morning after the election, my assumption was that, this was a key critical election. This was after 9/11, and there was a lot on the line, although nowhere near as much on the line as in 2016 and the elections that are coming up. But it was a big election, and I just assumed there would be thousands and thousands of people doing basically the same thing that I did, which was downloading this precious data. And in fact, nobody had. So I realized that I was the only one who had it. And the question was, well, what do I do with it? Where do I go with this? Who is going to, sound the alarm? And it eventually got out onto the web courtesy of a website called scoop.nz, which was in New Zealand. And they were the ones who did the publishing of it, put it online. And it found its way to Steve Freeman, who was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He and I got together. We started doing analyses, and a couple of other colleagues joined on. And I have to say that in 2004, we got a lot more data, a lot more information than they will reveal now. And we worked with that data, and we worked with that information. We made a very, very, very strong case that election had been corrupted and in favor of George Bush, looking at the presidency and probably quite a few down-ballot races as well, that the circus had begun. And unfortunately, that did not make much of an impression on the New York Times, the mainstream media, the paper of record, any of the networks. It was pretty much dismissed. Kerry had no interest in mounting a challenge after having collected $15 million for specifically earmarked for legal challenges to any sort of suspect results. I don't know if he pocketed it or whatever he did with it. He didn't spend it on any sort of a challenge. He conceded, and on we went. And that was sort of the beginning for me. And from there, it got more involved and more complex. More people brought on board, more people with sharing these concerns, and so founded an organization, Election Defense Alliance, and we worked. We tried to organize, we tried to lobby, and we tried to keep analyzing, election by election, whatever data we were able to get access to, and that has continued basically up to the present. And when you look at that mass of data, from all these elections, including, not just the presidential election, but at all these down ballot levels with national significance, the Senate, the House, all these state legislatures. It's a pretty, and the primaries as well. It's a pretty massive body of evidence. It basically all points in the same direction. It points to the right.
And I'd like to talk a little bit more about these voting machines, Diebold. I was once told in 2004, I met a gentleman and he explained all this to me. He knew what was going on. Somehow he had this information. It was very upsetting to him. And we talked about it in great length. And I can't recollect, did he say that it was actually a bank that it's like a banking machine initially? Is that who started Diebold?
Yeah, Diebold's major business was in ATMs and other types of, computerized data machines. They had an elections division, Diebold Elections Division, which subsequently was renamed Premier Election Systems. And they and ES&S, Election Systems and Software, is a Nebraska-based company, basically, through most of the 2000s, basically divided the share in terms of the kind of equipment that was used, whether they were touchscreen voting machines or optical scanners where you put in a paper ballot that the voter has marked. Basically, all of that equipment came from Diebold, ES&S, a little bit from HARD, a little bit from Sequoia. There were just a few outfits, and when you do some investigation, which should have been done a long time ago, and made public a long time ago, and you find out that the affiliation and the pedigree of these outfits is all right wing, all. They're the ones that have all.
Yeah, we know that. We know that the Republican Party has most of the money, so.
Yeah, I don't know. It may be a question of money. The Democrats actually, they do a pretty good job of milking the corporations and raising a ton of money, too, so they're not exactly poor. I think it was more just, this is tricky, why did people like Bob and Todd Urosevich, who had a family fortune and ties to the right wing, why did they, in the late 1990s decide, hey, we're going to go into voting machines. We're each going to basically take over operational control of one of the two main voting companies, Diebold Elections and ES&S. There was a lot more money to be made in slot machines or soda machines or whatever, but the voting machine industry, at least on paper, is not a moneymaker. And yet each brother went into one of these voting companies. So, you can get pretty deep into the weeds trying to trace that all. We're probably more interested in not so much who done it. That would be sort of an FBI investigation. We're more interested in, was that election honest? Were the votes counted accurately and honestly? And if not, what happened? And what can happen in an election? What are the vulnerabilities of these machines? And, of late, I'm not sure whether you saw it, but just this past Sunday in the Sunday Times magazine, the lead article was by a journalist named Kim Zetter, and she's pretty good on these issues. And they actually ran a lead article basically acknowledging that our voting processes, our vote counting processes, are tremendously vulnerable, and even acknowledging for the very first time in that I've seen anywhere in the mainstream media, that our elections have been corrupted, and that they will continue to be corrupted. The quote astounded me, because the context here is that up to this time, and this is a huge component of this story, and for people who are interested in whistleblowing and what kind of reaction whistleblowers get or truth tellers get, this is very key. The media as a whole has been absolutely shut down to reviewing, discussing, acknowledging in any way, even criticizing, even doing a reasonable analysis and critique of our analyses, of our evidence. What we present, is very strong evidence in any other field, in astronomy and agronomy and epidemiology. This kind of statistical evidence is standard stuff, and it's very strong. And we have these not just disparities, but patterns of disparities that are telltale, where you have competitive races that are shifted, non-competitive races that are not. Exit polls in certain states that are shifted and in other states that are not, and they're categorical. And you can go into that in more detail, and it's definitely a big part of my book of Code Red. But we've presented this stuff regularly, insistently, banged our head against that wall basically since 2004, and it's never gotten any acknowledgement. I mean, the most the media would be willing to do would be to, in the run-up to elections, to talk about, will your vote be counted? Are the machines vulnerable? Could something happen? But after the election, when we start collecting the vote counts, the exit polls, the pre-election polls, comparing hand counts with machine counts, competitive races with non-competitive races, and we basically start presenting the forensics that demonstrate that, whoa, your vote wasn't counted as cast, or there are problems with the counting system, and it's all pointing in the same direction, and it's correlated with this veer in American politics, which now has, basically Republican hegemony at so many of the state houses and the federal government, with consequences of Supreme Court appointments, federal court appointments, policies that are going to be very, very hard to undo. So just tremendously, weighty consequences. And we present all this evidence, and basically you could not talk about anything beyond just hypothetical vulnerability. If you gave evidence that that vulnerability had been exploited, in fact, by bad actors, you were shut out. Then came the Russians, and it began to be possible to talk about, well, maybe the Russians have interfered with our elections. And the sort of the irony of that, or the joke of that, is that it became possible to fear the Russians. Are the Russians coming for our elections? With never a word being spoken about domestic operatives, about Karl Rove or Roger Stone or Paul Manafort, or all this host of political operatives who are basically paid to win, who have pipelines to the voting machine companies, who have, to the best I could ever determine, zero scruple about the means used to get to the end of winning and maintaining power for their clients. And it was impossible to even hint or suggest that maybe this was a threat to our elections' integrity, at least equivalent to that posed by Russia, China, Iran, or some foreign state, because the access was so much greater. I mean, it's a lot better if you can program in a manipulative code, a rig, to put it simply, than if you have to hack in through all sorts of even inadequate security. It's a lot easier if you can do it as part of the programming process, part of the distribution process, and that is absolutely in the dark as far as our country goes. We seem to be unwilling. I mean, the code that's used, the memory cards that are used, the voter mark paper ballots that become part of the, fall into the OpScan when optical scanners are used, that is all regarded as completely 100% off limits to public investigation. The code is considered proprietary. Even election administrators can't ask, okay, how did Dominion Voting program this? How did Triad, one of the satellites that works in the Midwest, that works for these vendor companies, how did they program this? What's their code say? Can we take a look at that memory card? The answer is no. So the whole thing is being run as a fiefdom in complete secrecy. And this New York Times article finally got at that. I was shocked at how much leeway Kim Zetter had to go there. So maybe we're taking a step in the right direction to really facing this issue straight up. At the same time, I have to say, a thread running through the whole article was, how come nobody warned us about this years ago? Why didn't we know? It just wasn't on our radar. And of course, that made steam come out of my ears because my colleagues and I were doing that very thing. Steve Freeman wrote a book in 2005. Was the 2004 presidential election stolen? Vote Scam by the Collier brothers was written in the 1980s when computers were used in elections as part of the overall aggregating, tabulating process. They just weren't voted on. They weren't at the precinct level, but there were problems then. Bev Harris has been at this. Greg Palast has been at this. Mark Crispin Miller has been at this. And I've been at this. Code Red first came out in 2012, but long before Code Red. I was part of these films. I was writing articles. I was writing constant, letters to people at the networks, at the Times, and we warned America. America was warned loud and clear. And yet, when you read this narrative, it's like, well, Cassandra, why didn't you tell us about the horse? And that is crazy making.
One question I have, what preempted the implementation of computerized elections, other than probably the obvious wanting more ease to tabulate voting?
Well, I think you're on the right track there. I mean, nominally and ostensibly, it was a reaction that, the hasty, full computerization of the election, especially turning to touchscreens, where there was no paper trail at all, where it was all just inside the black box, inside, what I call the partisan proprietary pitch dark of cyberspace. That's where your vote goes. That was, ostensibly in reaction to, well, look what happened with the hanging chads, and when we have paper or punch cards or lever machines, it's so, antiquated, and there's all these, remember that iconic picture in 2000 of somebody doing the recount in Florida and looking at a ballot, with his eye magnified as he was looking through a magnifying glass. And it all seemed so obvious. Well, we should just, we have computers for everything else. Let's do our elections that way. So that was the sort of the immediate, the proximal cause. Behind that, though, there is, as you say, there's ease, convenience, speed of counting, and entertainment. And that's a huge part of it because we look at everything in our culture. This is, I don't know, we work so damn hard, but it's still effectively a leisure culture. Everything's about, watching the Kardashians, watching the NFL, watching the Super Bowl, watching, the Ryder Cup, whatever it is. We devote a tremendous amount of our time and our money to entertainment values. And elections, decision 2016, who'll come away with the power and blah, blah, blah. And it's, you get your red and blue flashing logo, you got your red and blue flashing states, you got your pie charts, you got your, pundits sitting there around the table on election night, saying why the male voters between 25 and 39 who are, to whom the economy is the most important issue, how they broke, why they went for this one, why they went for that one. This is like the Super Bowl. This is like, the World Cup for our country. It's an entertainment thing. And you couldn't have that if you counted the votes more publicly and observably. It would be harder to put on this whole entertainment extravaganza. It could still be done because you could have the machines count the votes, and if you had an immediate election night follow-up, whether it was a full hand count, they do this in one county, they do it in Columbia County, New York, but if a full hand count or a well-designed risk-limiting audit of some sort. You could have both. You could have that initial, and then you'd have a initial computer count, and then it would not be official or certified until you went through these steps of protocol. And so you probably could salvage the decision 2020 or whatever it is, Lollapalooza. But really, we just prioritized speed, convenience, everything's computerized, and let's, blend it into an entertainment thing. We prioritize that over integrity, over security. For whatever reason, we didn't think, well, if we computerize this and only experts or insiders are privy to the code or the mechanics of it, do you think maybe, given the value of an American election, given the fact that it's basically the highest stakes game in the world, there's more riding on it than any other contest in the world, a biennial American election, whether presidential or we're going to see in, just a month, the midterms. Do you think maybe somebody might be motivated to what they now, it's a charming little term, meddle in it, manipulate, rig it? And, if that can be done from the inside in a centralized kind of way, Donald Trump's worried about 5 million voters somehow getting the incentive to go and, vote illegally or vote twice, even though there's zero evidence for it. But when you're running the nerve center of the election system, the counting process, the aggregating process, and it's all being done in cyberspace, in the dark, whether it's connected to the internet at every stage or not, there's a point of access where insiders, especially those with ties to these voting machine companies and their satellites, can alter vote counts. And they can do it in a way, we know this, this is not conspiracy theory, the vulnerability part is just basically acknowledged across the board by experts, all the experts in the field, will tell you that they can do this without being detected. So the opportunity is there. The motivation is clearly there. Mm-hmm. And so then you have to ask, well, what is the impediment? What would stop this? And what you come down to is ethical considerations. Well, that's a line I would never cross. But these same operatives are uber cynical when it comes to vote suppression, when it comes to passing legislation or making regulations that make it harder for the opponents, in this case, minorities, young people, poor people, Democratic constituencies, essentially, potentially progressive constituencies, make it harder for them to vote, cut down their numbers, strip the voter rolls, and so many other schemes. Send out Vote Wednesday flyers and make Vote Wednesday robocalls to the homes of the opposing, voters that you suspect will vote for your opponents when the election is Tuesday. So people stay home on Tuesday and show up at the polls on Wednesday. And you may say, well, who would fall for something like that? You'd be surprised how many people fall for that kind of thing when it sounds official. So they're willing to lie, they're willing to cheat, they're willing to do all these other things, but we're supposed to somehow believe that given the opportunity and the obvious motivation, they would stop short and not just do the most efficient thing of all, which is to change the vote counts. And, if you ask how you could do that, you could take a memory card that goes into one of those optical scanners. It has between 500,000 and 700,000 lines of code on it. That's a lot of code. You interpolate, you insert 3 lines, you offset the zero counter. So let's say you want, let's just say for the hell of it, Trump to win and Clinton to lose. So in a given precinct, that memory card goes out, it sets Trump's zero counter to plus 100, let's say. It sets Clinton's zero counter to minus 100. That means the first person that comes in and puts in a ballot marked for Clinton she's going to move up to minus 99. First person who comes in and puts in a ballot for Trump, he's going to move up to plus 101 because there is no zero on a computer. If you're counting ballots by hand, the table is zero, and you put a ballot on it, it's ballot number 1. But in a computer, it's floating point. Zero can be whatever you make it, wherever you start, however you program it to start. So at the end of the day, let's say 500 people come in and vote for Clinton, 500 people come in and vote for Trump. Trump's going to show 600 votes. Clinton's going to show 400 votes. That's a total of 1,000 votes. 1,000 voters came in and signed the poll book. Election administrator looks at it, says 1,000 equals 1,000, stamped and certified, good election, and you've just shifted 20% of the votes. It's that easy. I mean, there are more complex schemes than that, and there are ways of doing it where the code is self-deleting. Almost all of these rigs are impossible to catch with logic and accuracy testing or pre-election testing, post-election testing. They can all be set to just be active on the day of the election. They can be more complex, but they can be that simple. And that's what, we don't know. We don't know what's going on there in cyberspace because it's a closed city. It's controlled by these corporations. And that is so antithetical to what should be the basic protocol of democracy. Is this is a public trust. This is a public function. Votes must be counted observably in public, whether that's a full hand count or it's a public observable audit process. The full hand count would be better. And, it would take some effort. Other countries have gone to it just, recently, the Netherlands, Norway, they joined Germany, Ireland, Canada. But those countries have shorter ballots. They're parliamentary systems. They have shorter ballots. It would take more work in the U.S. And then the question becomes, are we worth it? Are we willing, if we're not willing to put that sweat equity into our democracy, do we really deserve a democracy? I mean, I've served 12 days so far of jury duty. 12 days, of public, it's basically unpaid, or very low-paid public service. Gets in the way of things. It's a pain in the poop, but you go and you do it because it's how we ensure justice in our justice system. It would take 4 hours per voter lifetime. So once in your life, you'd have to spend 4 hours counting ballots for us to have a fully hand-counted, publicly counted paper ballot voting system where there would be counters and there'd be observers, and it wouldn't be happening in the deep dark of cyberspace. It would be happening under the public eye. 4 hours per voter lifetime. And, I can't imagine that if we were starting from scratch and we didn't have all these inertias, that we would look at that and say, well, that's too much. I'm not willing to put in 4 hours. Basically what it takes to watch one Super Bowl once in your life to count our votes and have that aspect of our democracy secured. I mean, there are plenty of other problems. There's big money, there's graft, there's greed, there's all sorts of other things. But this is right at the core. This is the fundamental, basic protocol of any democracy. And we have outsourced it to these corporations, and we've basically said, I believe, I have faith, I'm not going to question, I'm not going to look at it. And we've gone through a period where the results and the divergence of our political representation from the public will should be just knocking us in the head to the point where we say, wow, there is something wrong with this picture. Can we at least fix this most fundamental aspect of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just surprised there's not more alarm. I mean, when I first heard about it, he was a lawyer, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that. And he was a very bright man, obviously. He was just so outraged by his findings and what he had found out and discovered. So it needs to be mainstream. This needs to be like a mainstream discussion. I mean, occasionally I think I hear it trickle on there's little discussions here and there about it, but I think it just needs to, I'm surprised people aren't more alarmed or concerned, I should say, heavily concerned.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think alarmed. This is a crisis, and it's outright alarming. I mean, it should have begun with some concern, but it's been, it's like a cancer. You let the cancer grow long enough, and you're in ICU, and you're getting the last rites, and that's kind of what we've let happen to our country. I mean, the age of Trump. I mean, there are a gazillion books out there at this point trying to organically and reasonably explain how we got to this place. But it's no accident that you corrupt the electoral system and things begin to go bluey with your political system. And I'll say that even people on the right, the Trump base, the voters out there who are, I guess, hoping or hoped that Trump would somehow rescue them economically, rescue them culturally. They're not getting represented either. And that's the thing. A lot of times this breaks down, well, Democratic, Republican, liberal, conservative. But when you've corrupted an electoral system, it's really insiders against everybody else. It's the 1% or the 0.1% against the 99%, because you allow this manipulative control from the inside. And in favor of really the corporate point of view, the corporate policies, as if our system weren't already slanted enough in that direction. I mean, we can see the growing inequality. I mean, the exploding inequality. You can see the corporations getting basically everything they want, in a sense, from both parties, but certainly from the Republican Party. And the correlation with an electoral system that's broken should have occurred to people. And again, we're not looking at, from an election integrity activists or advocates standpoint, we're not looking at going back and rerunning any elections. We're not looking at, well, George Bush really didn't win in 2004, so, he shouldn't be president. That's water under the bridge. We can't really realistically, and even the Russians notwithstanding, we're not about to redo election 2016. For better or worse, Donald Trump is our president. It may have been with help from the Russians. It may have been through election theft. There may have been collusion, whatever. We're not going to be able to go backwards. Mm-hmm. It's really, perspective. It's really looking forward to what, if ever that idea held currency, that, change what you can change and sort of accept the rest. I mean, we're looking at a critical election coming up in 1 month, and we're looking at another set of critical elections coming up in 2 years, including all the primaries and whatnot. And not just at the presidential level, but all the way down to the secretaries of state of the various states that control election processes, to these state legislatures in all these states that have all veered red, with, the pundits sort of sitting around scratching their head and trying to figure out how, Wisconsin all of a sudden became a red state, and Minnesota is teetering on the edge, and Michigan's a red state, Pennsylvania's a red state. I mean, we're looking forward, and we're saying, well, this, if you want to call it damage, this has already been done. Whatever might have been achieved by foul means, whether that's, cynical voter suppression or outright rigging, it's been done. But what are we going to do the next time the public has its right of review? And that's coming in November. And what we've done is basically nothing. The system is more vulnerable now than it was back in 2004.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that we'll be able to restore some integrity to voting? Do you think that's eventually going to happen sooner than later?
Well, nobody's ever accused me of being an optimist. It's been said that I can brighten up a room just by leaving it. So the answer to that would be no, unless, and it's not going to happen through writing letters to your senator or your congressperson, and pleading with them and invoking democracy and all this. They are sitting too pretty. And by that I mean anybody who's been elected, Republican or Democrat, the system has worked for them. One way or another, they've gotten in, they've gotten through. They have very, very, very low incentive to mess with it, to change it, whether they're in the minority or the majority. Where it's going to come from is, if it comes, is something like Parkland on steroids, is something where you hit critical mass and the people of the country get this basic, simple message that votes counted unobservably in the dark behind a curtain are an open invitation to fraud and cannot be trusted. We got to do our elections right. And therefore, we must demand, insist upon, that our votes in future elections be counted observably in public and not just trusted to Dominion or ES&S or wherever their various satellites, that this has to be a public function. Now, that demand, it's hard to organize large groups of people. It's a lot easier to organize, at the top of the pyramid. Organize, your policymakers. When you're looking at something that is effectively populist or is coming from the voters, coming from the citizens, coming from the people of the country, that's a major challenge. And you can look at Occupy, you can look at the 60s, you can look at how difficult, even the civil rights movement, how long that took, coming from underneath, basically, coming from below. But that's what we've got to do. And when people ask, well, okay, what do we do? You've convinced me. We got a problem here. These machines can't be trusted. You've shown all the evidence. I've read Code Red. I see all the studies. I get it. I'm convinced. But what the hell are we going to do? I have two things. Basically, there's not a whole lot of easy answers here. Obviously, you could organize state by state, even county by county, and you could try to get ballot propositions on the ballot that amend state laws and possibly even constitutions to effectively institute public observable vote counting, mandate hand counting, or mandate a certain kind of audits, mandate at the very least that paper be used in all elections and that it be audited. But, remember that those ballot propositions are going to be counted by the current process. And there's some pretty strong evidence from the past that in the very few cases where electoral reform propositions were placed on the ballot, there were some huge red flags flying over those elections. It was like, the forces engaged to defeat them went out of their way to really just knock them off, make sure they failed. So if a ballot measure isn't necessarily to be trusted because it's being counted on these same computers when the vote is taken on it, the next thing is we live in a world of money. We live in a country that's all about money. We live in a profoundly capitalistic country, basically run by the corporations. And the corporate bottom line is an incredibly sensitive and incredibly important phenomenon. We, as individuals, have three forms of economic power that I'm aware of. One is we're taxpayers. Two is we're workers. And three, and by far the biggest and most potentially useful, is we're consumers. And, we could go on taxpayer revolts. It's been done in foreign countries, we could go on general strikes. It's been done in the past, even in our country, but very much more in Europe and other places. These are possibilities. But we could also marshal our power as consumers and say, we're not buying. We're not buying things that we don't need. And if you think about, there are way too many people in this country who can't buy anything beyond what they absolutely need because they're being kept in poverty. Mm-hmm. And they would not have much power in this particular way. But the majority of people in this country, and I'll confess, certainly myself, I buy an enormous amount of things I don't need. That Instapot, that flat screen, that new iPhone, that new car that I don't need, big purchases, small purchases, all sorts of stuff that we buy because we have the money, because it feels good to buy, because we're keeping up with the Joneses or getting one step ahead of them. This power as consumers, if we saw it in a different light, and if we used it politically in this focal way to say, you go to Scott Walker, you go to this Wisconsin Republican-controlled government in Wisconsin, and you say, we're not buying anything we don't need. And you can make a whole list of, items that are not necessary. And we're not buying any of those until you get together, sit down, pass legislation that mandates paper and audits and or hand-counted paper ballots done observably in public, period. And you get 1 million people to sign that. You get even just 10% or 20% of the state. This worked in North Carolina when they passed that ugly, ugly bathroom bill about the genders in the bathroom. Mm-hmm. And, the NCAA pulled out, the NBA pulled out, a lot of people got together, signed petitions, went on boycott, and it took them no time at all to pass a better bill. It wasn't great, but it was a lot better. The corporate bottom line is sensitive. Revenues drop by 2%. The boardroom goes into panic. The CEO gets fired. Really, really, they don't just go, oh, well, too bad, so sad. They react. And if you could bring about that kind of change, and it wouldn't be all that hard, because there's a lot of fat in our consumer budget. Our economy runs on what the consumers of America buy. And if we controlled that and we throttled that, we could get these changes to happen. But that's a lot of organization. Nobody's ever accused me of being an organizer. I've failed at organizing family picnics. So it's not me to probably go out and do that. It's not my strong suit. But there are people who can do that. And the key is to connect those people with people like me who have the cause and say, okay, this is a cause worthy of that kind of effort and that kind of organization. And there are a couple other things that one can do, too. There are things that one can do on election night that are much more local. That are a form of civil disobedience or civil action. That I talk about that in Code Red, too. And these are our powers. And, if they've taken away the power of the vote, if we're beginning to believe that, wow, my franchise has been corrupted, my capacity to make changes via the vote has been corrupted, then you're thrown back on other powers. And you don't want to be thrown back all the way to taking up arms and staging an armed revolution. That usually doesn't work out very well for anybody. It's something you really want to avoid at all possible costs. But before you get from elections to revolution, there are these mass actions and civil actions that are nonviolent and yet can have enormous influence on the way things are done. And that's something that I do talk about in Code Red. I do try to, and also on my website, I think when you mentioned my website at the beginning, you said Code Red 2008. It's actually Code Red 2018, 2018.com. And I talk about that, quite a bit in the book and on the website, because if we have nothing to recommend, if we have nothing that we can do about it, then this all just sort of becomes an academic exercise. So at one point, at some point, and that would be soon, we have to empower ourselves and organize, come together on this, recognize the problem, and take action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm definitely going to reach out to people. I'll probably take this recording and send it to some people because this is such an important issue to me. And one thing, I'm so glad that you, of course, you're more involved with this. You're an election forensics analyst, so you're the perfect person to connect to. But anything I can do to help out, I definitely will get involved because it's ever since I discovered it or was told about it, it's something that's bothered me greatly. And it is just really difficult to get a handle on. And, people, they're like, I mention it to people and they don't seem that, I don't know. I don't understand sometimes.
No,
some people,
I think, ahead.
I'm just saying, I think some people I think they want to trust. I think they would rather think that oh, it's a very small percentage of any type of hacking going on, or I don't know. Just it's hard sometimes to engage people on these important topics.
Well, that's a huge, huge part of it is the psychology of all this, and it's partly what makes me furious is that if you are an operative, and if you're sitting back in 2002 or whenever it was, thinking, kind of rubbing your hands together like the classic villain in some old movie, and thinking, well, what can I get away with? You realize pretty quickly when you make your first forays into this, just like embezzlers, they start small and then they realize, oh, I got away with that. I'm going to just go up the stakes, up the ante a little bit. You realize that you can get away with a tremendous amount because the mass psychology is exactly as you say. We don't want to believe this. America has had, I would say, its national self-esteem taken down notch after notch since World War II. I mean, I think we were obviously at a high in the conclusion of World War II. Not only had we, saved the world, and that quickly became pretty obvious, but, we were faced off against this evil empire over there and, this nuclear standoff, the Cold War. We were the good guys. They were the bad guys. We stood for freedom. They stood for enslavement, blah, 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 all this stuff. And our self-esteem was remarkably high. And then came, the civil rights struggles. Then came the Vietnam War. Then came Watergate. And then came many other, I guess, things that we had to face about ourselves that kind of conflicted with that image of ourselves as always heroic. And obviously for, people keeping score at home, we've done a lot of questionable, if not outrageous things internationally in other countries, whether it was Chile or Iraq or whatever. So, our self-esteem just down, 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 down. But the one thing we could always cling to was we were the first, complete representative system of government, Republican democracy. We do it right. Our elections are, the model for the world. We're the beacon of democracy. This we know about ourselves. And so that's like the most painful and the most difficult thing to acknowledge is that even in this area, the last thing that we cling on to, we've been negligent, we've been lazy, and we've been corrupted. And so people don't want to know. And I encounter the same thing. I mean, and a lot of people even who just sort of say, well, I'm worried, I'm concerned. But to turn that individual worry and concern into something that is critical mass, that is a national cause, takes enormous amount of energy, and it takes a commitment on the part of individuals to, I call it, go ahead, ruin somebody's day, go out there and talk about this, communicate about it, tell them about Code Red. There's a book you can read about this so it wouldn't all be mysterious. There's websites. There are other books. There are even a few mainstream media articles. Go check out the New York Times, Sunday magazine from just this week. Remarkable for them to go this far. Trust me on this. Remarkable. They really went.
About another minute left, just so you know.
Yeah. So there's a lot of resources, and it just really becomes a question of, as a good coach would say to a football team, how much do you want this? How much do you want? And you got to go and approach it as if it is that kind of do or die thing, because the consequences could not be greater, and we all have to do our share and pull our weight. If we want to have a democracy, we've got to be able to keep it.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Jonathan. Everybody pick up Jonathon Simon's book, Code Red. You can pick it up on Amazon. And what's your website one more time?
CodeRed2018.com.
And don't forget to donate to our station. Go to freedomslips.com. Please, 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 please donate. We're all doing this to help out, and we just need to keep these stations alive and keep people like Jonathan coming on and sharing information. So thank you, everybody. And Jonathan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good one.